So as a lot of us have noticed, Nintendo seems to be having a little bit of trouble, which is something you really don't want to have, especially during a time when in a way, you're the only game in town, or I guess only 8th generation console in town. A lot of people have been wondering what the hell's been going on with Nintendo. A new console gets released, yet a lot of people don't even know it's out. And in a way it seems like Nintendo isn't even trying to do anything about it. They don't really seem to be advertising much lately. But I believe that it's not that they don't want to, or even care to, but that in a way, they kinda can't. The current situation that Nintendo's in seems to involve an assumption made by Nintendo, and in a way a lot of us as well, that on the surface seemed like a good idea until executed, and now seems to have backfired. And I'm sure Nintendo didn't expect it to. To really understand what I mean, we have to think about what Nintendo always did before as opposed to what they attempted to do this time. Now in the past, when it came to advertising and consoles, Nintendo was always the company throwing everything they made in your face, be it a console or exclusive game made by Nintendo themselves, which of course makes perfect sense, especially at the start when they weren't even known that well, yet it ended up exploding all over the world. But this generation, we noticed that didn't happen at all. Why? What was the difference between Nintendo's heavy advertising in the past and their lack of it now? My answer? Despite Nintendo releasing a new console last year, technically, they weren't actually ready for the 8th generation. And in a way, they still aren't. So then why did they release a console they weren't really prepared for? Well, this is where I believe Nintendo's, as well as some of our own incorrect assumptions come into play. When you think about the way Nintendo advertised during E3, one comment that a lot of people remembered them making was that the Wii U would be for the hardcore gamer. This of course not being the Nintendo hardcore gamer, but the fan base of Nintendo's competition. But as we all knew, there was no way Nintendo by themselves would be able to pull that off, due to the games they themselves made. Which of course meant what Nintendo was really saying was they would have more third-party support to create the titles that Sony and Microsoft's fanbase liked so much. At this point, we pretty much knew exactly what Nintendo's plan was. It was too obvious, especially when you realize that their main titles weren't really brought up much if at all, which when you think about it goes against what Nintendo normally does and also explains why Nintendo released the console when they did, despite even themselves not really being prepared for it. But this meant that in order for Nintendo's plan to work, other developers would have to advertise their own titles while making sure to tell us the most important thing. We could only get this experience on the Wii U. This was something that Nintendo themselves obviously couldn't do until they knew for a fact that a lot of developers were going to jump on board. The plan almost seemed flawless, as this would prevent Nintendo from having to advertise their own main titles that they themselves weren't ready for. But that's when the problems began, and the perfect plan backfired. It was around this time that a lot of us started hearing negative things said about the Wii U. It wasn't that strong, its version of Batman Arkham City wasn't that good, it was bricking on a lot of people, it only held 32 gigs of space. But what really hurt Nintendo was what the developers were saying. We started hearing a lot of developers complaining that the console just wasn't all that good when compared to its 7th generation competition. And it almost got to the point where every time one bit of news was released with something negative to say about the Wii U, more negative news was right behind it. This clearly wasn't the plan that Nintendo had for a console that even they weren't ready for. They knew that they weren't going to be able to advertise it much, but the other developers were supposed to give Nintendo more time. So now Nintendo had two problems. They weren't ready yet, and developers were complaining. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse for them, it did. When Sony realized that the perfect time to strike would be a time when Nintendo was having their own problems and Microsoft hadn't said a word. February 20th. At first I didn't understand why Sony did what they did on that particular day, especially since when I saw it, it seemed like less of a, hey gamers, look what we have, and more of a, hey developers, look what you can do. But once I saw the whole thing, it all made perfect sense. Sony wanted to do three main things, one of which wasn't that important at the time. Give gamers a reason to be excited for the PS4, give developers more of a reason to develop games on their new console, and most importantly, do it before Microsoft gets a chance to. These goals weren't too difficult to pull off. Getting gamers excited at this point came down to a first-person shooter here and a new character there. Getting developers to feel much safer developing on their console came down to showing the specs and what can be done with them. And beating Microsoft to the punch, well, that one worked itself out. Then, instead of waiting until it's too late to mimic what Nintendo does, Sony decided to start off with it. Very smart tactic this time. You see, if the gimmick were to fail for Nintendo, it wouldn't hurt Sony too much as they didn't change the main design of their controller. If developers didn't want to use the controller's gimmick, they didn't have to. And since the controller itself is so similar to the DualShock 3, a new controller wouldn't even be necessary. And if it becomes a huge success for Nintendo like the Wiimote did, Sony already has that prepared. It seems that despite Nintendo beating Sony to the finish line, they didn't really give Sony a reason to enter the race in the first place. Sadly, at this point, a lot of developers may feel it's safer to simply not develop for the Wii U at all. and Nintendo themselves still aren't quite ready for their own console, and Microsoft could end up stealing Nintendo's casual group due to much heavier advertising. As while Nintendo didn't really do much advertisement even for their casual fanbase, as we all know, Microsoft will advertise the hell out of it. And at this point, due to all the negative things being said by the developers, the only company that can convince people to buy a Wii U is Nintendo themselves. Those who weren't too fond of Nintendo's style, sadly still won't be due to the lack of support that most of us assumed Nintendo would get. Which means, the only company right now that has to try and bring in the other fanbase is ironically the company they didn't like to begin with. And for those of us that actually do like what Nintendo makes, we have to play a waiting game. So a game Nintendo started playing in their favor, ironically turned into their biggest threat: time. I still believe it's too early to count Nintendo out of the race, but they're really starting to push it. At this point, the last thing they need is for their plan on the hardcore gamers from their competitors to not care for the console, while at the same time, letting Microsoft steal the main fan base that made Nintendo so much money last gen. Most of us know what now truly sells Nintendo consoles. We know because they've sold them every generation that Nintendo's been a part of. But if they don't even give a lot of us who are Nintendo fans the games we really want, and not the ones we have to pretend we want, this could end up being a generation that Nintendo has to struggle with even worse than that of the GameCube.